Hello and welcome to episode 8 of Reflecting the Way Radio. I'm your host, Evan. Let's get started. A little bit of housekeeping right at the front end here. If you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to head over to the website, reflectingtheway.com. It's linked in the description box below if you're listening on Blog Talk Radio. Be sure and check out the content there. You're also going to want to make sure that you sign up for our email newsletter. We don't spam you by any means. We generally send out an email once every week, maybe every 2 weeks, and we only send out updates of relevance. Generally, when there's new content, we'll send an update. So be sure and sign up for that. You won't be sorry, especially if you're following the series we're just starting to get into here. That's the title of tonight's episode, Saturn, the God of 1,000 Names. And before we dive into that, I'll also say, be sure and check us out on Facebook. We are Reflecting the Way on Facebook, and we are also at Reflect the Way on Twitter. Both of those are also linked in the description box below. And there is an accompanying article to tonight's episode of the same name, The Sin, Curse, and the Mystery of Iniquity, Saturn, the God of 1,000 Names. This is part 3. We're just starting to get into the meat and potatoes of our series on Saturn. So I would encourage you to make sure you check out the written version of this article as well. There are a couple of visuals in that article that will be of interest to you, I'm sure. And let me just say from the outset, right as we get going here, that if you didn't hear the warning associated with this series, I would encourage you to have a listen to this before we get started here. If you feel weak in your faith, please stop listening. If you feel that you do not have your spiritual armor on, please put your armor on and come back when it is. And if you feel that the Holy Ghost is telling you you are not ready for this material, please turn back now. Now, I realize that is not in my best interest to say in terms of listenership and views for my website and social media sites, but nonetheless, I don't want anybody walking into this unprepared. And I don't want to be responsible for shaking anybody's faith. This is a dark topic with some very heavy implications, so consider yourself warned. All right, so Saturn, the God of 1,000 Names. Last week, we talked a bit about Saturn symbolism. We went through the basics, a very, very 101 course on the symbols associated with the deity and the planet Saturn. Never really talked about why it matters, though, and that's a bit of what we're going to get into a bit here on this episode and in the associated article. So many of you, when I say the word Saturn, the first thing you're going to think of is the ringed planet. And fair enough, that's what you were taught in school. And maybe some of you, when you studied the solar system in grade school or elementary, you may have heard a passing reference that the names of the planets were taken from Greco-Roman mythology. Now, chances are you heard that in science class, not a comparative religion course, so that's probably as far as that went. This can be a bit confusing, I admit, but for the purposes of this series, here on out, when we talk about Saturn, we are talking about both the planet that you can see in the sky as well as the entity associated with it. And I hope that will make itself clear as we go along here, but Saturn is both a planet. What that planet is up for debate. And it is either an entity or a group of entities working through this archetype. Which it is, whether it's a single entity or multiple entities, I tend to vacillate on a little bit. I haven't quite made up my mind which way I think this goes. It's my opinion that there are at least 2 entities associated with Saturn, being that it is a dualistic entity in the occult. It's both male and female. I believe, and we can discuss this maybe in a different series, that the male aspect of Saturn is Satan, what we would understand as Satan or the serpent in the garden. And the female aspect of Saturn, and this is going to maybe make your head hurt, the female aspect of Saturn is Lucifer. And I know you're always taught that Lucifer is male, but in the occult, Lucifer can easily be associated with the female. And I don't want to get bogged down on that right now. We'll probably come back to that. In fact, I'm pretty sure we will. But for the time being, just understand that Saturn is both a planet and an entity or entities, okay? It's a planet and an archetype. So to understand what this entity or this archetype is about, I'll discuss him in singular terms for our purposes this episode. And because the name Saturn is associated with the planet, for the Western English-speaking folk who have been taught that the planet is Saturn, and we as Western-speaking English folk, I'm assuming that's mostly who I'm talking to here, we have at least some grasp on Greco-Roman mythology. This archetype or this entity is present in almost every religion and almost every culture throughout the world and throughout the ages. But for our purposes, I'm going to focus on the Greco-Roman myth at the beginning. And at the end of the episode, I'm going to bring this back around and we will talk a little bit about some of the other entities that fall under the Saturn banner. I hope I haven't lost you already, but moving forward here. One other thing I want to clear up is I'm going to tell you the story of Saturn according to the Greco-Roman tradition, but I'm going to mix names. And the reason I'm going to mix names is because the names of your planets are mixed, in that some of them are Greek and some of them are Roman or Latin. Saturn is a Roman Latin deity. Jupiter is Greek. The Roman sorry, I just got that backwards for you. Saturn is the Roman entity. The Greek equivalent is Kronos. Jupiter is the Roman name for that entity. The Greek equivalent is Zeus. Now, when you get to some of the other planets, things are reversed. Uranus is a Greek name, and the Roman equivalent is Caelus. Okay? Now, this, like I said, this is confusing because these are our planet names and names of entities. We're going to focus on Saturn, and I'm going to use the words Saturn to refer to Saturn and Kronos, which are the same entity. One is Greek, one is Roman. The stories are the same, okay? The Roman mythology evolved out of the Greek. The names changed, the stories changed very little. They evolved, but the stories stayed the same between the Greek pantheon and the Roman pantheon for the most part. And I want to use the names that most of the people listening are going to be familiar with. So I will refer to Saturn when we refer to Saturn or Kronos. When I refer to Saturn's father, I will call him Uranus. Now, I'm mixing names there. The Roman name for Saturn's father is Caelus, but because most people are familiar with Uranus, I will refer to him as Uranus. Saturn's mother, I'm going to use the Greek name for her as well. Her name is Gaia. Most people are familiar with Gaia, or Mother Earth. The Romans called her Terra, but I will call her Gaia because most listeners will be more familiar with that name. Okay, so moving on. Hopefully we're all on the same page here. In the tradition of the Greeks and the Romans, you have different generations or tiers of gods. The first generation are somewhat amorphous. They're kind of etheric. They represent principles more than actual entities. You have Mother Gaia, who represents Earth, okay? You have the sky, who is Uranus, or Caelus, but we will call him Uranus. You have Mother Earth, Father Sky, Gaia, Uranus, okay? These are kind of etheric, amorphous. They're not anthropomorphized. They don't have like a persona the same way some of the later deities do. But they gave birth to the second generation of deities called the Titans. And the Titans, when you think of the Titans, you probably think of entities such as Saturn or Kronos, or Hyperion, or Ops, not sure how you say that one, Oceana. Those are all examples of Titans, this first generation of offspring from the amorphous, etheric creator deities of the Greco-Roman pantheon. The Titans were overthrown by their own offspring, just as the progenitor gods were. Gaia and Uranus were overthrown by the Titans, and the Titans were subsequently overthrown by the Olympians. Some Olympians, you might be more familiar with these names. This is where you have entities like Jupiter or Zeus. Most people will be familiar with Zeus. Hades would be an Olympian. Hades is an entity as well as a location. Poseidon, if my memory serves correctly here, falls under the category of the Olympians. Somebody can check me on that one if you want. I am flying off the cuff here a little bit, so bear with me. And then you have fourth and fifth tiers of deities here as well, but we're not going to get into those too much for our purposes. Maybe at the end I'll just make a mention, but we'll come back to that. So maybe you're wondering why this matters to you. Speaking of circling back around, just hang in here with me, and we're going to tie all of this back to your Old Testament and the genesis of different gods surrounding and related to the Israelites, and some of this is going to probably melt your brain a little bit, so hang with me here. So the story goes that Gaia and Uranus, Earth and Sky, came together and they bore the Titans. And Saturn was the youngest of the Titans, and there are different legends or myths surrounding this, but basically what ended up happening is there was a revolt of the Titans against their parents, and Saturn was basically the tip of the spear, the entity I'm talking about here. He was the one who was the only one, he was the only one who had the guts, basically, to actually go after his father, the god of the gods, Uranus, and depose him. And the way he did this, nice kid, is he actually castrated his own father and deposed him from his throne. Okay, so the first thing that's interesting here is that Saturn has been through antiquity associated with the god of harvest. Because he's associated with the god of harvest, in antiquity, he is also associated with carrying a scythe or a sickle. This is the tool that, according to myth, Saturn used to castrate his own father and overthrow him. This symbol carries through today in depictions of your Grim Reaper. And I'm going to come back to that. Keep that in the back of your mind. Saturn carries the scythe, and he's associated with the Grim Reaper. Okay, so Saturn overthrows his father. After Saturn overthrew his father, his mother, Gaia, who was not injured in most myths, she was not injured in this coup d'etat. She issues to Saturn a prophecy. Now, before I get too far ahead of myself, Saturn also took himself a wife. And his wife was also his sister. Her name was Rhea. That's the Greek name. The Roman equivalent is Ops or Ops. O-P-S is the spelling. And Gaia issued Saturn a prophecy after he overthrew Uranus. And the prophecy was that just as Saturn had overthrown the progenitor gods, his children would overthrow him, and the Titans would be deposed, just as the generation before them. Well, Saturn and Rhea had children. They had many children. And Saturn liked the idea of holding on to power. So he had to come up with a way to impede the prophecy given to him by Gaia that he would be deposed. So, nice guy that he is, this Saturn fellow, he decided, well, if my children are the ones that will overthrow me, that's easy. I'll kill them all. So every time Rhea would give birth, Saturn would immediately devour the baby. You heard that right. He would eat his own children. Charming fellow. And if you go and take a look at the accompanying article to this episode, linked in the description box, if you scroll down, I've got two depictions of antique medieval art that show Saturn depicted as the gray-bearded deity that he was, eating babies. And this is another picture that is commonly associated with this deity and with this archetype. So he ate his own babies. This also ties in with other pagan deities. When you're looking for this Saturn character in different religions, if you find the deity that is responsible for child sacrifice, and to some degree human sacrifice in general, but especially child sacrifice, find that deity, and most likely you're looking at the slimy devil that is Saturn. Okay? So Saturn would eat his own children. Rhea wasn't such a big fan of the fact that her husband kept genociding her offspring, so she devised a plan, and understand this is Greco-Roman myth, and it doesn't necessarily make complete sense. I do believe they were telling a true story in some sense, but they may have lacked the language to explain what was really happening. But according to the story, Rhea convinces Saturn that a stone wrapped in I just lost the word, wrapped in infant clothing, for lack of a better word, was in fact his latest born child. And Saturn swallowed the stone whole and thought he'd eaten his kid. Well, Rhea had spirited away the child, who would later grow up to be Zeus or Jupiter, depending on which pantheon you're looking at. And when Zeus, Jupiter, same entity, when Zeus, Jupiter grew up, he deposed his father, and he locked all of the Titans in Tartarus. Now, if you're a keen student of Bible prophecy, you will know Tartarus is actually mentioned in Peter. It is referred to as the place that the fallen are held in chains. I think you can also extrapolate and say that Jude, when quoting Enoch, was probably also referring to this same compartment of the underworld known as Tartarus. So Saturn was deposed just as Gaia predicted that he would be. Now, the story is more interesting than that even, and by interesting I mean disturbing, because according to this myth, Saturn, during his reign, while he's busy eating babies and having cut his father's manhood off, was ruler of Earth. He was ruler of all the mortals. And according to the belief, during the time of Saturn's reign, it was called the Golden Age. You may have heard that kind of talk somewhere else, but this is where it comes from. It's from Saturnalian mythology. And during this Golden Age, it was believed that mortals needn't work, that the earth provided everything without need for agriculture. There was a bounteous harvest that could be eaten at will. Nobody had to work. Immorality was absent, and there was no need for codified laws. Now, this runs deep into the occult, into the New World Order, into the Illuminati thing. They're trying to get back to the Golden Age of Saturn. I won't go too deep on that right now. We'll come back to it. But just understand that they believe that by coming back to the age of Saturn, they can bring back this golden era. Now, this should give you some idea. This should be one hint as to what the entity behind Saturn is up to and what he's all about, because this sounds somewhat disturbingly like depictions of the Garden of Eden, does it not? Okay, now the timing of this golden era, I have no doubt that there was such a time. Whether the god described as Saturn was the god of it or not, I think we could have a very interesting conversation, and we will. The timing of this golden era is also something that is very interesting to me. Whether this is a co-opting of the Garden of Eden story, or if this harks back to a time before the fall of Lucifer into pre-Adamic history, is another possibility. And I'm not quite sure I've nailed this down yet, but I will cover this in the future in greater depth. Probably actually in the next article and episode. But just keep that on the back burner as you go through this series, that Saturn was in charge of a golden age, an age that ended, and he fell from grace, for lack of a better term, and was deposed by his offspring. Do I think the minutia of that story is accurate? No. Do I think the Greeks and Romans were portraying or retelling a story that happened? Yes, I do. Do I think that there was fallen tinkering with the story? Yes, I do. We'll come back to that. Okay, so remember I said Saturn was associated with carrying a sickle because he was the god of harvest, and he castrated his father and ate his babies. Nice sounding guy, right? Okay, well, there's another aspect here that I want you to piece together with those two other little tidbits, and that is that Saturn to the Romans was called Kronos to the Greeks. Kronos is where English and Latin get the name or the words based around time. Chrono, chronological, chronometer, chronic. They're all to do with time. Not only was Saturn the god of the harvest, the god of infant death, the god of destruction, and the god of limitations on mortals, but we'll probably come back to that. These are all aspects of Saturn according to the Greeks and Romans. He was also the god of time. And him being the god of time ties into him being the god of destruction, because what is the one thing that, given enough of it, can turn anything to dust? It's not nukes, it's not chemical weapons, it's not biological weapons, it's not any man-made device, it is time. Given enough time, anything will be turned to dust. Everything, given enough time, is destroyed. So Saturn is also the god of time. And you'll remember, if you listened to the last episode or read the previous article, when we went through the basics of Saturn symbolism, that when you dissect the hexagonal symbol of Saturn from its North Pole storm, you can get an hourglass. This is why. Saturn is associated with time, just as the hourglass is associated with the measurement of time. Okay? You'll also remember I just made reference to the Grim Reaper 10 minutes back. What is the Grim Reaper? Well, he is death, right? He carries a sickle, and he's constantly associated with the clock running down or the sand running through the hourglass. If you look at the pictures on the associated article that's linked below, you will also see, even in this medieval art, that Saturn is shown as a very dark entity. In some cases, he was also shown wearing a hood. I don't have any of those pictures there, but you can do some research on your own for that. The imagery of the Grim Reaper as death in the West, and actually in a lot of the world, comes from both Saturn and a specific event during the Black Death, but we'll get into that maybe later, maybe not. It's kind of related, but not directly. But the images of the Grim Reaper are Saturn. Saturn is death. When you think of the entity of death and you see the Grim Reaper in your mind, you're looking at Saturn. He has the scythe, and he's associated with your time running out, the sand running through the hourglass. Okay? So when you're looking for this character, for this entity hiding behind whatever demonic mask he is in any given culture or religion, you can look for this archetype of death, time, harvest, death, sickles, the god of time, okay, destruction, darkness, because black is the color associated with Saturn, if you'll remember from our previous article and episode. And this is everywhere. It is literally everywhere. When you start to look, you start to see it behind every bush and under every rock. Now, this series is not so much designed to look back as it is to look at the here and now and how this pertains to the average follower of Christ today. But in order to understand how this is strictly relevant to you and to the church, the true church, we do need some basis in history to know what we're dealing with here. So I won't park too long. I don't park too long in the article, and I won't park too long talking about all of the different ancient deities that are associated with Saturn. I'll touch on a couple here in a minute. But there is one at the end that I'm going to touch on, and you're going to want to pay attention. So a very good example of a deity associated with Saturn from your Bible is Moloch or Molech, depending how you want to say it. He was either a bull or an ox, and the ox is interesting. We're going to come back to that. But Molech demanded child sacrifice for financial gain. He was associated with the color black. He was horned, just as Saturn is sometimes depicted as being horned because he is ruled by Capricorn, which is the horned constellation. Okay. Molech, the entity that powers Molech, is itself the same entity or entities behind Saturn. The other interesting thing about Molech, found in your Old Testament, is that the Moabites and some of their neighbors, it's speculated, worshipped Molech as a male figure. Interestingly enough, in different sects of paganism, depending if you're talking about a satanic sect or a Wiccan sect or a Druidic sect or whatever, depending which sect you look at, Molech can either be worshipped as a male or as a female. Molech has some interesting gender confusion going on. Now, you'll remember Saturn is itself dualistic, male and female, right? It represents, in one way or another, depending on which aspect you're looking at, androgyny, gender bending, okay? Molech is, for lack of a better term, a transgender deity, just as Saturn, to some degree, depending how you look at it, is a transgender deity. And we're going to come back to this gender bending aspect, and we're probably going to hit it pretty hard because this ties right in to Mystery Babylon and the Antichrist. For those of you who think that the Antichrist is going to be a suave man's man, think again. That's all I'll say about that. Okay, so this entity can be seen all over the world. Admittedly, my knowledge of the Far Eastern religions is not comparable to my knowledge of Middle Eastern and Western religions, but when you look into Hinduism and Buddhism, you also see this archetype. Buddhism and Hinduism both use the swastika. Most people didn't know that. That's where that symbol comes from. The swastika is from the East. Hinduism and Buddhism use the swastika for different symbols pertaining to their different deities. Well, the swastika is nothing but a bent or a curved X. And you'll remember an X is a Saturn symbol. It also represents something called the black sun. And we're going to come back to that because Saturn, by some cultures, was called either the sun, the greater sun, or the greatest sun. That's an interesting study on its own, and that may be in the next article. But that is swastika, okay? The swastika is a Saturnalian symbol. And if you study Nazism, besides looking at the Hindu and the Buddhist philosophy behind it, the Nazis will tell you that they were the Lodge of the Black Sun, and they were associated with the fraternity of Saturn. And the swastika comes straight from there. So Saturn is in the Far East. If you look at Hinduism specifically, Shiva, who performs the dance of the cosmic dance of destruction. Boy, I can't talk very well this episode. In one of his hands, he holds the Ouroboros, which is the snake eating its tail. And if you'll remember from our basic 101 Saturn symbols, rings and circles represent Saturn. They also represent the cyclical nature of time, especially when you have a serpent eating its own tail, okay? And the circle, as it pertains to Saturn, represents the female aspect of it, right? Now, remember Saturn is the Lord of Destruction? Well, Shiva dances the cosmic dance of destruction. Also, where do you see Shiva today? Outside the gates of CERN, right? CERN, the giant ring that goes in a circle and bends time. Are we picking up a pattern here? Sticking with Hinduism for a moment, you also have the goddess Kali. She's a black-skinned vampire, essentially, and Oppenheimer, after he lit off the first atomic weapon in Trinity, New Mexico, he was asked about what he thought about this first weapon. and he made a comment to the effect of first weapon. Well, it's the first modern weapon of such power. And he's referring back to the Vedas, where there's, I'm a little going off on a bit of a rabbit trail here, but that's okay. The Vedas in India suggest that it's possible that the gods, for certainly, and possibly mortals back, I say mortals just to, common man. Anyway, that the mortals back in either pre-flood or directly post-flood had access to nuclear weapons. Now, if that blows your socks off, just go look it up on Google. I'm sure you'll find it. And he quoted Kali when he said that. And he quoted Kali out of the Bhagavad Gita, which is a Hindu holy book. And Kali, this black-skinned, black Saturn vampire goddess, says in the Bhagavad Gita, and famously quoted by Oppenheimer, he said, "Behold, I am become death, destroyer of worlds." That is more Saturn symbolism. Okay, so we've seen it in the Middle East, we've seen it in the Far East. The Americas have their fair share of it. They worship the plumed serpent, right? Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan. Many of the listeners listening will know that the Aztecs had a bit of a proclivity for forking hearts out. Again, that will trace right back to Saturn, sacrificing humans. Now, what I find interesting and what you may find uncomfortable, and you should find this uncomfortable, is another association here. And I want you to think carefully about what I'm saying. When you read your Old Testament, there are basically two distinct groups of names given to the God of the Old Testament. One is Yahweh, the other is El. Okay? Have you ever stopped to wonder where those names come from? I won't cover Yahweh in this series. I may do that in another series because that's an interesting study all on its own. But ask yourself this. In Genesis and in Job, throughout the Old Testament, in fact, but those two specifically are the ones I find interesting, the name given for God during the creation story is Elohim. The base word of the name Elohim is El, E-L. Where does that name for the God of the Old Testament come from? Okay, just think about that for a minute. It is well understood in archaeology that El is not a uniquely Judaic or Christian name for God. The Hebrew people come out of Canaan, also known as Phoenicia. They weren't a nice group of people, these Canaanites. They had some serious issues with Nephilim genetics. And the chief god of their pantheon was a gray-haired old man, similar to the depiction you see of Saturn in the article, linked below. The chief god in their pantheon was a gray-haired old man called El the Kind. El. Okay? When God told Abraham, pick up your stuff and move, Abraham took El with him. Now, Eusebius, whose name I cannot say properly, was a Christian historian of the 4th century, pre-Constantine. Okay, so we don't have to worry about that council getting in the way here. He asserted that the Canaanite El was the same deity the Greeks called Kronos. Romans called him Saturn. Abraham took El with, I'm going to say this again, Abraham took El with him from Canaan, which is where the deity originates. He took El with him, and El is Kronos to the Greeks and Saturn to the Romans. Okay? Stay with me here. Don't turn me off just yet. We're going to come back to this. this is coming to the crux of what this series is ultimately dealing with. There is a clever deception afoot here. Let me make this very, very clear. If your heart is to serve your Creator, to serve the Father that Jesus spoke of, you are serving the Father. However, there has been mixing when it comes to the names given to what we call God. Okay? And I want to speak slowly so that nobody minces my words. Do not take me out of context. When Jesus said, "When you've seen me, you have seen my Father," that is the God I serve. I pray that is the God you serve. Let's get this one thing clear. Jesus first, Jesus always. Okay? When we look in our Old Testament, we see, I will not say that the Old Testament itself is telling you lies. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the devil, or Lucifer, has done a very good job of conflating names in such a way that he thinks he is tricking the chosen, the elect, into giving him praise by having us worship to the wrong name. Okay? And now if this sounds a little woo-woo for you, riddle me this. If the names in the Old Testament for God were so squeaky clean, why didn't Jesus use them? When he recites the Lord's Prayer, so-called, he says, "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." But he never gives you the name. In Revelation, when Jesus comes back, he has a name written on him. It's his name, and only he knows it. Okay? For all of these folks that think you have to pray in the name of Yahweh or Yahuwah or Yahovah or whatever the pronunciation of the week is this week, or speak with the name of El or whatever, I would challenge you. Do some serious research and find out where that name comes from. Because you're going to find out that the name El traces back to Phoenicia, Canaan, okay, land of Nephilim giants, and he was a deity associated with the same entity that runs Kronos and Saturn and Molech and Kali and Shiva and however many other false gods out there. Let me say this one more time. If your heart is to serve the Father in heaven that Jesus spoke of, you are serving the Father in heaven that Jesus spoke of. There is an aspect of intentionality. God knows your heart. And when I say God, I mean the Creator, Jesus is Father, okay? The Creator knows your heart, and he knows who you're worshiping too. However, we still need to know where these names come from, the story behind them, and their associations. I can't unpack all of this tonight. It's too much, and we need a bigger base of research and understanding before we can unpack how this all works. But in the meantime, understand, there has been a deception here for many thousands of years. And not all the parties involved are malicious. Some of them are doing it in ignorance. In fact, most of them are. And we will come back and I will explain why and how the name El has been tainted the way it has. Just remember, Jesus didn't use the name of his Father when he prayed to him. So that should tell you something. And if you think I'm off the deep end, that's fine. But I would encourage you to come back, follow this series through, and we are going to unpack this. And you may be surprised at the depth of understanding that you are shown by following this through. I can only talk about this so much, because if you don't have spiritual eyes to see and ears to hear, you will not comprehend this. So there's nothing I can do about that. but I would encourage you, I would implore you, and I would beg you, go to the Father for discernment so that you can understand what is afoot here. And take what I'm saying to the Father and ask him to tell you if what I'm saying is true. Now, like I said, I'm not saying that Christians worship Satan. That's not what I'm saying. Don't misquote me. Don't take me out of context. But I'm going to leave it there for now. And my prayer is that you would have fresh discernment and fresh eyes to understand what we're dealing with here. There's a reason I put a warning at the top of the show. So I'm going to leave you there for this episode. Go check out the articles. Stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe so that you get the next batch of info in this series. And we will unpack this, and you will come into a new level of understanding that you didn't know existed before. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave you for this episode, and blessings.